Welcome to Talking Pictures. My name is Christian Genzel. I am a filmmaker and film journalist from Salzburg, Austria. Talking Pictures is a podcast series in which I talk to the people who made some of my favorite movies. Today's guest is Mike Curb, best known as the head of the independent record label Curb Records, which started out in 1964 as Sidewalk Records and is still going strong in 2025. Over the years, Curb have released records like the best-selling Coyote Ugly soundtrack album and music by Gloria Gaynor, Willie Nelson, Bananarama, The Four Seasons, LeAnn Rimes, Sixpence None the Richer, and many other great artists. Mike Curb has also served as the Lieutenant Governor of California from 1979 to 1983. He's owned a NASCAR team, he renovated a house owned by Elvis Presley, he supports many charity programs through the Mike Curb Family Foundation, and much more. The focus of our conversation, however, lies on the films Mike Curb was involved in back in the 1960s. He scored Roger Corman's biker movie The Wild Angels starring Peter Fonda and worked on numerous other biker and counterculture films of the era. He produced the soundtracks for films like The Glory Stompers starring Dennis Hopper or The Devil's Angels starring John Cassavetes. He scored Richard Rush's The Savage Seven. He released the music for Corman's LSD film The Trip on his own label, and was involved in many of the other films released by American International Pictures at the time, and so his music was instrumental in creating the sound of that particular part of film history. My interview with Mike Curb was conducted in connection with our German language podcast Lichtspielplatz. So, if you speak German, please visit lichtspielplatz.at and check out episode number 77, which features an in-depth discussion of The Wild Angels and other biker films of that era. If you enjoy my interviews here on Talking Pictures, please consider heading over to patreon.com/talkingpicturespodcast to support the production of new episodes. And make sure to check out our other interviews on our website, talkingpicturespodcast.com. So, without any further ado, here is Mike Curb.
I had a band called the Arrows at the time. They later became known as Davy Allen and the Arrows, featuring our guitarist. Devil's Angels, was John Cassavetes. Skater Dater, which was my first one, which was nominated for Academy Award.
The short film, right.
And I did all the music to it. That's where I got started. Roger Corman heard the music from Skater Dater, and he said, I want that in The Wild Angels. I have a video on the Wild Angels video. There's a video of Roger Corman speaking, and he says, I told Mike Curb on the Wild Angels, this is not Skater Dater, this is the Wild Angels. And he said, I told Mike Curb that the two hot groups are the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, and this is supposed to be the Rolling Stones. So on Wild Angels, we had that wild fuzz tone guitar that you probably heard, and then we had a big hit single called Blues Theme, which Blues was the character that Peter Fonda played in the Wild Angels. And so, and the Blues Theme was his theme. Every time he came in, it went bam, bam, ba, bam, bam, ba, bam, ba, that real hard fuzz tone guitar that Davy Allen played in our band. And so that's what Roger Corman liked, so, and of course he was the king of those movies at the time.
Yeah. And that would have been my first question, how you got on board of the Wild Angels. I mean, you had already been so active as a performer, as a producer at that time, and yet I think you were in your early 20s at that point. So I think that must have been just a wild surprise to have somebody approach you and ask you to provide the music for a biker feature, right?
Well, it was kind of like a miracle because I didn't have any funding and I was starting my company. And Skater Dater, the two guys, Marshall Backler and Noel Black, were actually students at UCLA at the time. So, and my sister was going to UCLA at the time. I had dropped out and I was starting my business. And when they invited me to do the music, they had heard a Honda. I had written a song when I was a teenager called "You Meet the Nicest People on a Honda," and through a little bit of good fortune, it had ended up as the theme for the radio commercial. You meet the nicest people on a Honda, and it kind of spawned a group called the Hondells that had a couple of albums and a couple of hit singles. And we did albums of Honda music. But the guy, Marshall Beck or Noel Black, heard that and asked me to do the music for Skater Dater because there was no dialogue in the film. It was all kids on skateboard. So if the skateboard was going down the street and the skateboard went under the wagon and the kid jumped over the wagon, the guitar went, and the guitar would follow. We were in effect scoring the movie with rock and roll instruments, at a time when most movies were doing the more traditional, da-dun, da-dun, with horns and everything. And we were doing it with the rock and roll beat. So when that hit and Roger Corman heard it, he said, I want that composer to do the Wild Angels, but he wanted it to be the Rolling Stones. So if you hear the music on that, as you know, blues theme sounded almost like it could have been a track to a Rolling Stones song, so we got into that and the harder rock with the movies, and then Wild Angels became, and then Devil's Angels, and then Tom Laughlin with the Billy Jack movies, the Born Losers. I wrote the Billy Jack theme. It's one of my favorite ones. Well, I'd like to know a little bit about you, because I was very impressed with your interest in this, and I looked a little bit. I'd like to know how did you get started, and how does this all work?
Well, my interest in movies actually, I don't know when it started. Basically, when I was a kid, I was always interested in films and film history. I think I never cared so much about if a film was new or old or anything. I just wanted to understand more about the films and how they were made, and that's basically what I've been pursuing most of the time. I've done documentaries, I've done the podcast, I write about movies, I study them, and I'm also a big music guy, so I've always been very interested in the connection between film and music. And one of the things that I always found very interesting is just how much something tells us about the time it was made in, right? How things are connected to history and how things are sort of a mirror of what was going on. And I think that's why the era that we're talking about is so interesting to me, because there were so many changes at that time. There was so much that was really rapidly changing and moving in a more interesting direction, I guess, a very experimental direction, and not just in movies, but in music, in literature, basically everywhere.
And for me, it was actually rock and roll coming into films, and filmmakers who were going with the more traditional scores, all of a sudden they were saying, wait a minute, maybe we can score these films with rock and roll music. And that's what was happening in the 60s. It's that film, I don't like to call them B movies, but the teen movies needed teen music. And Roger Corman was sort of the first guy to realize that. And so the whole score would be a rock and roll band. And then, my God, I probably have right here, 60 different albums here of all the
amazing
Riot on the Sunset Strip, Wild Angels, Skater Dater, Devil's Angels, Wild Racers, Born Losers, Billy Jack, Devil's Angels, Psych Out. They're just Glory Stompers, Thunder Alley, Killers 3, which starred Dick Clark. Killers 3. The trip, I showed you The Trip with Michael Bloomfield, Buddy Miles, Hell's Bells. There's all these soundtracks. Some of them you probably never heard of. Major League. It started getting better later. Of course, Legally Blonde came much later, but we had John Lennon, Power to the People, on our soundtrack to Legally Blonde. But I don't know. There's all these films were fascinating, and for some reason, I was lucky enough. Well, once we had the hit album, the Wild Angel soundtrack album was a huge hit. Probably 400,000 or 500,000 units, which was huge at the time. It certainly got my company started, and so then it allowed us to sign Linda Ronstadt, allowed us to sign, and a lot of the singles from these films like Max Frost and the Troopers, Nothing Can Change the Shape of Things to Come, came from Wild in the Streets. But now I didn't write that. That was written by Barry Mann and Cynthia Weil. all of a sudden the big name writers started getting interested. And of course, when I was doing the films, I didn't care if I wrote the song or one of my associates did, or if we found one, if we were lucky enough to get a song written by Barry Mann and Cynthia Weil, we did that too.
I noticed with a lot of films, sometimes you produced the songs and sometimes you wrote the songs, sometimes you provided the score, or sometimes you were the arranger of the score, or it was put out on your record label. So I was wondering how you approach the individual films and, how that collaboration process went when somebody like Roger Corman comes to you and says, I need music for this film, or someone like Richard Rush comes and says, I need music for the Savage Seven. How does that work?
Well, first of all, in the Savage Seven, my recollection is we had the Cream and the Iron Butterfly. So there was a case where we co-ventured the soundtrack with Atlantic. Ahmet Ertegun, was still there at the time, but that he actually, it was really interesting. Atlantic wanted the Cream and wanted Iron Butterfly on the soundtrack album. So it was exciting because all of a sudden we had these groups doing the same thing that my band was doing, but they had already had hit records, and so it really to drive the soundtrack album. But in that particular case, then we used their music. We did the instrumental part and so forth. But obviously, if we had an opportunity to get Cream at the Eric Clapton, or we did that because it meant so much to our soundtrack album and to the promotion of the movie. But I mean, we were doing so many, and I had like 6 or 7 people just at my company writing and cues, and we always wanted to make the cues good. We didn't want to just throw it together like a lot of times you hear. We were really, and we tried to do it in a way where we could also put records out, where we could make at least versions of it that were long enough to be a record. We had instrumental hits with songs like Blues Theme and the Wild Angels. The Ventures, who were the big instrumental group at the time, recorded the Wild Angels theme and released it as a single. And that was good for the film, and it was good for me as a songwriter. But it was a very exciting time. I mean, too bad I didn't know you then. Of course, you're probably a lot younger than me, but you would have been great at this because you're so interested in it. And do you have a musical background as well?
No, unfortunately not. Other than really a passion for music, I can't play an instrument or anything. Unfortunately, no.
Well, that's okay. It's funny. Some of the best music people are people who love music and don't actually play an instrument. And we need everybody. And in my case, I do play guitar and piano. Piano is my main instrument, but it helped me a lot in the writing of the songs to be able to play the piano, because I would have to make demos of them. And then I had my band, the Arrows. We had a guitarist, a bass player, and a drummer, sometimes a saxophone player. So we did a lot of this with just a small combos. It was really interesting, but it was a very exciting time. I wish I could go back to it.
I kind of envy you that you could experience it. It is an exciting time, I think. And the sound of your records, I think, is very specific. When I listen to those soundtracks, that's a very specific sound with the fuzz guitars and the Hammond, the psychedelic overtones, but also the harmony vocals and that particular drum sound that you have, that sort of crashing drum sound.
We had a very good drummer named Larry Brown, a very, very good guitarist with Davey Allen. We really had a wonderful, and they were all three they were in the choir in my high school, and when we started playing at school assemblies, I realized, I said, wow, there's magic here. There's something going on. Maybe we could someday have hit records. Maybe we could do a movie. And then it's amazing. Success comes when opportunity meets preparation. And so we rehearsed and practiced, wrote songs. So when the opportunity came to do the Honda commercial, we were there. I met Bobby Darin, the famous singer. He had an office at Capitol Records. And I was in an elevator, and he was in the elevator, and I almost didn't recognize him because he didn't have his toupee on or anything. But the minute I saw him in the elevator, I said, "Oh, Mr. Darin, loved all your records like Splish Splash and Early in the Morning, Mac the Knife, and Beyond the Sea, and Dream Lover. You know, I'm still remembering them, but I was so much in love with the 45 RPM record. I was collecting every one of them, and I still have them. And I just wanted to make those records. And then when the opportunity came, then Bobby Darin said, well, would you like a publishing contract? And I said, yes. And then he said, well, let's take the Honda song over to the Gray agency. And sure enough, it, you know, I mean, they probably paid me $3,000 or whatever, but suddenly we were on the radio with a song and then the next thing, you know, Mercury Records, Nick Benet said, well, why don't we make an album? And so he came up with the idea of calling it the Hondells. And then we started taking Hondell songs. We took a Beach Boys song from their All Summer Long album called Little Honda that was written by Brian Wilson and Mike Love. And we made a record. I made a record with my group, and I was so excited about the record. And Nick Benet, who used to produce the Beach Boys in the early days, you know, before Brian Wilson took over as producer, Nick Benet did all those early records like Surfing Safari and, you know, the 409, they were really early ones. He was the producer at Capitol, and he was now at Mercury. He said, Mike, he said, we need to replace, we did a version of Little Honda. He said, Mike, we need to replace the lead singer and get someone with more bite like Mike Love. Well, I was the lead singer who was being replaced. But I didn't know if he knew that or not. So I went out and found, or we went out, I don't know whose idea it was, but someone suggested Chuck Girard. And Chuck was in a group called the Castells. Now, I don't know if the record hit in Europe, but they had a record called, you know, Sacred, Our Love is Sacred. Yeah, I don't know if you remember that song, or Oh, So This Is Love, Real Love. And yeah, they had those, pardon my hoarse voice, but they had two big hits, pretty big hits in America called So This Is Love and Sacred. But Chuck had a bite to his voice. So that night I went into the Capitol studio and put his voice on Little Honda and took mine off. And the next day, Nick Benet heard it. He said, wow. He said, Mike, do you still have your Woody? I said, yes, I have it downstairs. He says, is your electric piano in there? I said, yes. He said, bring it on up. So I brought it up. He said, I want you to set it up. He said, I want this to be your office. And I said, why? He said, well, this time yesterday, you were a lead singer in a rock and roll band. And last night, you became a producer because you took your voice off and put the right voice on. And he said, and I think this is a hit record. So Nick put the record out on Mercury, and the record went all the way to the top 10 on the bill. I think the number 8 on the Billboard chart. You know, you probably remember First Gear, It's All Right. Second, I'm sure it was maybe even a hit in Austria or Germany. But do you remember the song Little Honda?
Yeah, I remember it.
So, I mean, my mother never liked me to tell the story. She said, you tell people you got your job by taking your voice off a record. but I think that Nick felt maybe I had some talent as a producer. And probably that was good for me, because if I had just been the lead singer in a group, I might still be doing that, you know, playing bars, and, you know, and things like that. And by starting to be a producer, I was able, you know, get more income, maybe get royalty overrides,
Mention
and,
your keyboard being thrown in the water.
What?
Your keyboard being thrown in the water.
Yeah. My wife just mentioned that my keyboard, we would play at fraternity parties, you know, at UCLA and USC and the California fraternities. And those guys would get, you know, pretty drunk. One night one of the guys threw my electric piano out the window, and fortunately or unfortunately landed in a pool, you know, and then I didn't know what to do. I retrieved it. I was really distraught at the time because it was my most important possession. But then I started messing with it, and all of a sudden it had a fuzzy sound. And then I said, you know something, maybe I can use this. I use that piano a lot with the fuzzy sound. So maybe I need to find those guys that threw my piano out the window and thank them. But we had kind of a fuzzy sound, or sometimes we would sustain. It had a kind of an organ opportunity where it could sustain, like on Blues Theme, we could lay that bed behind it with the organ. It almost sounded like a Hammond organ, but it was there was really an electric piano that was on the organ function that had been thrown in the water. I mean, all these things, but to me, it's kind of a miracle. To me, I believe in miracles, you know, and the miracle of meeting Bobby Darin in an elevator, and then he helps me get my first song on a commercial. You Meet the Nicest People in a Honda, and then two guys at UCLA, Noel Black and Marshall Backler, hear it and ask me to do Skater Dater, and then Roger Corman hears Skater Dater and asked me to do, you know, to do Wild Angels, and then Tom Laughlin hears the Wild Angels, wanted me to do the Billy Jack films like Born Losers, and then Dick Clark heard the Billy Jack theme and wanted me to do the music for his film and wanted me to write the theme for American Bandstand, which I did, you know, and then the producers of Hot Wheels heard it. They wanted me to write the theme for Hot Wheels. It's still on the radio. I mean, still on the, not on the radio. It's still being used today by Hot Wheels and their cartoons still on. So a lot of those songs that I wrote, like American Bandstand theme and Hot Wheels, are still being used. And then when we finally got to bigger movies, like we did a Frank Sinatra movie, and we did Kelly's Heroes, Clint Eastwood, and then I had I had built up my school choir, and they were called the Mike Curb Congregation, and we had a worldwide hit with Burning Bridges back right in the early 70s, right, almost 1970, 71, and it still plays today. The Kelly's Heroes movie. It was really about a group of guys that couldn't make it in the military themselves. They couldn't make it as individuals, but when they all got together under the leadership of Clint Eastwood, they were able to conquer the world, you know. So it's sort of like my record company. Everybody says you have a little, you know, so I was talking to someone the other day, said, your company is so eclectic. Your CFO is gay, and your head of your legal department is Jewish, and the head of and you have a woman in charge of business affairs. We have a very eclectic company that is comprised of people from all different walks of life, but they've all been there 30, 40, in some cases, 50 years working together. And our company's still going, and we're still having hit records on Curb Records now. And, you know, so we got one record going for #1 on the Billboard Country chart this week by Dylan Scott. We have Lee Brice, but we have a rock band called For King and Country that are Australian. They're getting a lot of attention. They're selling, their last album is platinum in the US, and they're doing, you've probably heard them, they're doing rock. And they came out of the Christian music business, which we're also involved in, which your namesake. So, but I mean, to me, these all just seem like miracles that happened. And just, you know, miracles, one thing we know is you don't get them if you're not open to receiving them. And each time, it just seemed like each time that I was looking for the next step, something opened up, and then we just pushed through to try to make the most of it.
Yeah, I always find it fascinating how one thing leads to the other, and sometimes it's just, you know, it's basically a coincidence. But like you said, you have to sort of set the stage for those coincidences to happen, and you go with the flow, and then it's kind of amazing the kind of journey that evolves from there on.
And well, how did you get into doing podcasts?
Well, that started, let's see, how many years ago? I think 9 years ago. Basically, just a friend of mine approached me and said, look, we talk about movies so much, and we study movies, and we're interested in just the background story of movies. Why don't we try and record something, you know, and talk a little bit about some of our favorite films? And, you know, that's basically where we started. And then at some point, we just started doing more and more. We read books and articles to, just sort of dive deeper into whatever topic we were talking about. And then we started doing interviews, and then we started doing, all sorts of additional stuff to really talk about films also that maybe sometimes didn't get as much attention. Or, sometimes it's a movie that really is very popular, but we're talking about aspects of films that aren't really very often discussed. So, yeah. Again, well, it's really one thing led to the other, but
Yeah, because you seem so knowledgeable. Well, how did the counterculture movies do in Europe?
well, they were pretty popular. I mean, The Wild Angels obviously was very popular here, and Easy Rider, of course, was the big hit. And I have to say, many of them these days are probably forgotten, except for the more like the bigger ones. I mean, obviously everybody remembers Easy Rider, but I don't think a lot of people remember the Glory Stompers.
No.
Um,
Well, you said The Wild Angels was successful there in
yeah,
Europe.
it was definitely successful.
Good.
And basically the era is still something that people talk about, and it's something that people still look at. Probably also because of the music, obviously, because so many legendary figures came out of that time. We were talking about Cream and with people like Jimi Hendrix, and yeah, I think it's still something that people react to.
Well, it's funny, I had an apartment, but I went through the $3,000 pretty fast from the Honda commercial,
Mm-hmm.
and I lost my apartment, and I moved into what was the janitor section of a building on the Sunset Strip, and I had an office there that I didn't want to give up my office, so I lived right up on the roof in the janitor section, right next to where the elevator shaft was, and it was right across from these clubs like Gazzari's and the
Mm-hmm.
Whiskey A Go Go, and it was just amazing. I actually got involved with what was then the Chicago Transit Authority, which later became Chicago, but actually got involved as a partner with Jimmy Gershow for a while on that. I would hear them across the street performing, and sometimes I wake up at night and I go back or I dream about it because it was such an interesting part of my life. Roger Corman said that I was more radical than, I don't know if he meant musically or what. I didn't really have time to be radical personally because we were working night and day. But he saw me as being radical. So I think that maybe my music, in those days, the fuzz tone guitars and the music we were doing, for particularly Wild Angels, with the bongos and the drums, and it was just a really exciting time for me. And I sometimes wake up in the night dreaming about it. It was a beautiful time in my life. I almost wish I could go back there because it was all music. It was all music, and wake up in the morning, you could hardly even have time to get dressed. You pick up your guitar, you're working on music, and people would come over and you'd collaborate and work all day long on. It was all about music, and then the paperwork. I had a friend who was a lawyer, and he would do the paperwork. I never had to worry about it. A beautiful time to just roll out of bed and do music, and then and not to worry about whether you had a haircut, not to worry about anything, just to try to make the best music for these films, and then do everything you could to get them to be released on a record. And I had my own little record label, so it was a very nice time. I wish I could go back to that time, because now it's so businesslike. Now, I mean, I love the business. I learned. I mean, we're selling our records to 90 different digital service providers directly.
Wow.
Our company, and I've got 60 full-time people, but probably almost 100 when you count all the independent people who are permanent. And we're rocking in Nashville, Tennessee. We moved 30 years ago. This is my 60th year since I started as a teenager, when I was going to Cal State, before I dropped out, when I was going to Cal State University. And I started back then, I think I was 18, and this is our 60th year now of doing this. And we, it's unbelievable how it's grown. And the first 30 years we were in California, starting on the Sunset Strip and then moving out to Burbank. And then the last 30 years we've been in Nashville, Tennessee, which has sort of become the center of the American music business. Have you been to Nashville?
No, unfortunately not. I've been to LA many times, but unfortunately not to Nashville.
You'll enjoy it, I think.
I'm sure, yeah. One of the things I was curious about is how much you collaborated with the directors, like with Roger Corman, for example. How much did you sit down to discuss certain scenes or individual just cues and moments?
Well, a lot, because basically the secret of doing music for films is giving them what they want.
Mm-hmm.
So I would try to get inside their heads. What do you want? You want it hard? You want it soft? How do you want to, we would watch the movie. We didn't have the high-tech stuff back then, but we could watch the movie, and then we could take the scenes, and I had a studio and I could actually run the film on a screen in my studio, and then my band would play the music, and then we would try to, but instead of doing the, I couldn't write it out. I wasn't trained to write it out in like a traditional score. So the band, we would sit all around the studio room, and then we would look at the scene and say, how do we build up that scene? And then sometimes the director would say, hey, I'd rather not use the music there. Other times he would say, could you go back and make it a little harder there? And could you build it for the first 4 frames and then build a little further? And then I would take notes. I mean, I was very, very serious. I saw a video recently that when I was on American Bandstand, but I think I have it on one of these tapes with Dick Clark. I said to my wife, God, we look so serious, but we were really, this was a serious business to us, and I somehow missed out on the whole drug thing. My wife and I never did drugs, and people say, why? I said, we never had time. We never had time. No one invited me. No one ever invited me to bars. I don't know if they thought I was square or what, but we were just, I would roll out of bed in my underwear and start writing, and it was basically at night I'd be so tired I would just crash. Sometimes I'd wake up and I would have just fallen asleep with my clothes on. I was working so hard to make this work. I had to pay for my office. By then I had a number of employees, and I wanted to, consistency is so important in life, whether it's in a marriage or whether it's in your business, trying to be the same person every day and trying to provide consistent work for the guys who were writing with me, and because they also had apartments and they had, some of them were even starting their families. So I think I was very responsible during that time, and didn't realize it, although I did enjoy it. And I liked the radical fringe. I liked the fact that everybody could be who they were. Nobody had to worry about, whether they were socially right or how they were dressed, or, whether in Hollywood, whether or not so many people were gay. And they turned out to be some of the best writers I worked with. And that culture was very important because the gay culture was kind of getting into the early stages of what later became disco. They had their own clubs, and the clubs had a more different tempo for the music. I didn't get to go often, but I went to 2 or 3 of the clubs to get an idea of the music. And a couple of my writers were gay, and so they had membership to some of these clubs, and they would take me there to hear what was happening with the music. Disco really came out of those clubs. We ended up having Gloria Gaynor. We had her first hit, where she covered the Ice Cake, Never Can Say Goodbye, which was actually the first #1 disco record ever, before Donna Summer. It's a great trivia question. When Billboard did of course, by now you're in the 70s, but when Billboard did their first disco chart, the first #1 was Gloria Gaynor on our label with Never Can Say Goodbye. And then Donna Summer took over, and that was that. But Gloria went on and had some more pretty big records too, didn't she? So she's still alive. But the disco scene sort of came out of off the Sunset Strip into the clubs, and then all the clubs started doing that. And then a lot of it for me was living on the Sunset Strip, and where you were at night going to bed hearing Chicago playing at Gazzari's or playing at the Whiskey A Go Go, or Johnny Rivers. You'd hear him there so often with his band. you're just hearing rock and roll and sometimes unique sounds. I mean, groups with horns. I mean, Chicago, look, they were playing with all the brass, so it was quite an amazing time to be. I remember one night the Turtles were playing across the street at Gazzari's, playing Bob Dylan's I Ain't Me, Babe. Actually, that was their first hit, It Ain't Me, Babe, by the Turtles. They were on a little label called White Whale, and they were right across the street from my label, which I couldn't get the name Curb, so I used the name Sidewalk initially because it was as close to Curb as I could get. And then there was another label called Cub, so I couldn't get the registration for CURB because there was a label that was called CUB. But then a few years later, I got the rights to Curb. So I've been doing Curb Records for almost 60 years. Kind of crazy, isn't it?
It's amazing, yeah.
Yeah, it is crazy. It's nice to slow down and have a nice interview.
One of the things I'm curious about is The Wild Angels, of course, was a film that dealt with something that was very topical at that point, the Hells Angels. And I think Roger Corman really did just a fantastic job of just capturing that moment in the counterculture where there was such an interest in the biker culture. I was wondering how much you knew about the Hells Angels at that point, and if that was something that interested you, or that was something that that was controversial maybe at the time.
Well, it was definitely controversial, no question about it. But the president of a lot of these films were made by a company called American International Films, AIP. You probably see that on there a lot. They were very successful, and Sam Arkoff, who was the president and co-founder, along with Jim Nicholson of AIP, said, "Mike, let me tell you something. Kids like movies that repulse their parents. and you need to make music that repulses your parents."
Okay.
No matter my music definitely. My father obviously didn't relate to my music, but he was an FBI agent. He didn't need to. But my mother, of course, the problem was my mother and my grandmother thought everything I played was the greatest thing that ever happened. So they loved it, listening to the rock and roll, and they let me have my band play in the middle of the living room. And my father would come home from work, and there'd be loud guitars and everything. So, but we put together. I've recently, through the copyright reversion, there's a 56-year reversion in our country. And I've just recently got the right to put out a lot of this music and to compile it. We had the Davy Allen and the Arrows, of course. Anything they did for any of the movies, we have organized as Davy Allen and the Arrows, and we have an anthology album showing all their. In fact, Linda, I have it right there. If I can show it to him, it's right on the chair. Those two albums on the chair right there. So we sort of organized the music into three. The Davy Allen and the Arrows did an anthology. One of the top writers, Seth from Rolling Stone, actually wrote about it, and then inside, I could send you one of these if you want. Inside, it shows all the albums, the sound, the ones the Arrows did.
Wow.
And you sort of see it there. And then we did a second album called Best of West Coast Rock and Roll, where we take all the different records, everything from Hot Wheels, all the the Chevrolet theme, but some of the rock and roll music that was released on singles, starting by the various groups and the various names, and then leading up to where the Mike Curb Congregation having the big hit Burning Bridges from Kelly's Heroes. But we're organizing an album. My band, when we scored films, we went under the name The Sidewalk Sounds, because that was the name of the label. And so I have an album I'm putting together of the 25 best film themes that the Sidewalk Sounds did, like starting with the Billy Jacks theme and the American Bandstand theme, things like that. And then I have a second album where I take the original group, the Buddies, before it became the Arrows. The Buddies actually sort of became the Hondells. But the Buddies records that we did early on, which Little Honda was one that they actually used the track by the Buddies for the Hondells record. But Glenn Campbell played guitar on most of those records. It was just before he became successful. And he played guitar on those instrumentals, and he had this thick driving guitar. And Nick Venet, who co-produced them with me, had produced the Beach Boys, and we redid all the records in the Capitol studio. My wife and I were listening to them the night before last. They sound real thick, but I could send you the Buddies 25, the Sidewalk Sounds, which was our orchestra for the films, 25, and then the Arrows anthology, I think, has on it, I can't count them all, but it looks like it has at least 25, starting with Blues Theme. And we had the American hit of Apache. I know in Europe, I think another group, not the Strangers, but I'm trying to remember the name of the group that had the hit of Apache in Europe, but the Arrows had the American hit. Now, Jorgen Ingman had you probably remember that record, right? Jorgen, does that name ring a bell? Jorgen, he had a record that was a European record that was the first record. Jerry Lorden wrote Apache, but Jorgen Ingman, and I imagine with a name like Jorgen, he was probably German, was he?
It sounds like it, yeah.
But he had the original hit of Apache, and then there was a group in England that recorded. We recorded in America, but of course we did it as kind of called an Apache 65. We did it more like a Ventures rock and roll record, but that was our first chart record on my label by the Arrows. So it was we've had a fascinating, at least a long journey, and it hasn't let up. I mean, it's my New Year's resolution this year was music every day. Let's keep this thing going. We're having hit records in multi formats. Our company, I mean, some people think that Curb Records is the top independent in America, at least, because we do our own streaming direct. We do our own streaming to 90 different DSPs, and that's so. We are probably the largest independent that is independently distributed. There might be some independents use major distribution, and that's a different thing. They're being paid by one source. We do all of ours. We have a hit. If we find a song that we believe is a hit, we can put it out the next day. It's throughout the world on 90 different DSPs. So you don't have to have a separate distributor like we used to in Austria, or a separate distributor in Germany. You put it up for the world on Spotify, Apple, Amazon, 90 different DSPs. It's about all that. I can't believe I keep thinking I'm getting more lives because I've led quite a few lives here, but now right now we're dealing with all this new, all the new technical things, which I've never been that good at. I've never been very good at technical things, but I've always put people around me who are good at it, and then I keep every day I learn something new. It's like your iPhone. Every day you learn something else that it can do. It's the same way in the music business now. You just learn, and what AI is doing is very good in terms of enhancing the sound of catalog records. There are also some obvious risks there that we're all very exciting.
It's amazing. One thing I was curious about, I don't know, this is just maybe because I mentioned Easy Rider as one of the films that was so popular at the time, and I know that Roger Corman had initially set it up at AIP, and that didn't come together, and it was ultimately produced elsewhere. So I was wondering if you had heard about Easy Rider at that point, and if you were at some point maybe even involved or supposed to be working on it.
I helped Roger Corman on it, but I was not in charge of Easy Rider. Roger had an idea to take groups like Steppenwolf, you know what I'm saying, to take hit. At this point, he was trying to get better distribution for his films, and he wanted to use hit bands, hit groups, hit records, in the score. So it wasn't like Wild Angels where we had to score every segment. But he was my friend, and I helped. He finally got a Lifetime Academy Award 2 or 3 years ago before he died, which is really he lived 96 or 97. But Easy Rider was fascinating because Easy Rider was kind of taking Wild Angels and trying to put it into the major film market and trying to get like Wild Angels would open here and open there, and we'd follow it with our soundtrack album. Easy Rider had a world debut. It was Roger's way of saying, I'm in the big time. So I mean, I think that I wasn't in charge of the music there, other than he probably called me 7 or 8 times to help, and I always helped him with anything he did, but I didn't score it like the Wild Angels.
There were also 2 films at that time where you were involved in as a producer, the Glory Stompers and Cycle Savages. And I think on the Cycle Savages, you're the executive producer with Casey Kasem, and the Glory Stompers, you're an associate producer. Both of them were also produced by Maurice Smith. How did that come about?
Well, I liked Maurice Smith. He was an independent guy. Yeah, interesting. He was talented, and he wanted an album, a soundtrack album with kind of what he called, I don't think it was new wave, but he wanted new groups. Max Frost and the Troopers, Eddie and the Stompers, these kinds of groups. He wanted to bring kind of new, I guess today we'd call them alternative groups. And he wanted them in his film. Of course, we had the Arrows do it, because Casey, I think, was in this movie. Casey in the Glory.
He was in both movies, actually. Yeah.
Well, he was my best friend. Casey Kasem and I had the fun of starving together. We always said we both had absolutely no money. He was starting out wanting to be a DJ. He was from Michigan, and I was trying to start a record company. And we would go to McDonald's, and it was a really kind of exciting. And then he got his first job at KRLA, and then he was magnetic, his voice. And he did on this DVD that I'm sending you, he did some of the intros on those.
Okay.
I did the eulogy at his funeral, but he was my closest friend at the time, and we really had a great time together. I helped him get started in voiceover and things like that. And of course, he played my records, on the local radio station, which was really good because the people who make decisions in film were listening to the radio out there. And there were 2 stations, KFWB and KRLA. And KRLA was really coming on. And he had had a really good show on KRLA. So we kind of built together, and then he started American Top 40, and I helped him with that as well. So he was a fabulous person. I would give anything if he were here. I miss him all the time. But we did that film, and the other one you mentioned was Cycle Savages, and they were those films were pretty radical. Now, I guess by today's terms, they wouldn't be as radical, but they probably were at the time. But Casey wanted to act, and he played a Hell's Angel in the movies, But I've never ridden motorcycles, and I've obviously never been a Hell's Angel. But I enjoyed riding. I enjoyed riding about people. I like people. People, and I like all kinds of people. I like a great big purple open world, a rainbow. A rainbow's what I like. I like rainbow. I think when you have people from a lot of different cultures, a lot of different countries, a lot of different musical backgrounds, I think that's where you get the most excitement, because it's so hard when you're sitting down to do a movie. How do you make it different from the one you just did? And because the producers will always say, "Oh, give us a song like Blues Thing. Give us a song like Burning Bridges." Well, when you give them a song just like that, it's hard to make that one a hit. So hits come from when you do something different. that's been a big challenge for me, is being able to, put people together and back then and try to say, what could we do different? What's a new sound? Is there something? Is there a new instrument? Is there somebody from Europe who can play it, can help us produce it? Is there someone that's got a technological background that can give us something that's a little high tech that makes our record sound better? Now it's AI. Back then it was all kinds of different things. We would hear sounds. We would hear these people like Giorgio Moroder and some of the producers in Europe, or you listen to ABBA and you say, wow, that's so thick. How did they get that big, thick sound? I want that sound. What do I have to do? There was a studio there that they used that, in addition to brilliant arrangements and production, we had that in America. We had a studio called in New York. Columbia had a studio, and they would put artists in there like Johnny Mathis or Ray Conniff, or they would put Marty Robbins. They would bring him to New York, artists with great voices, and the records would sound so thick and round. You could take a Johnny Mathis record now and you put it on and you say, wow, it sounds like it was recorded yesterday. And it was because it was an old church that had been turned into a studio. And we have that on Music Row in Nashville. There's a studio called RCA Studio B, where Elvis recorded 300 of his hits. He wanted to go there because his voice sounded thicker and he could do things with his voice that he couldn't do elsewhere. And the Quonset Hut, there's a magical point where Brenda Lee stood or where Patsy Cline stood. And my wife and I have bought those studios and refurbished them, but kept them historically. We have done that for about 12 properties on Music Row. And then we have a college that we have been building with Belmont, the Curb College for Music Business. We now have 3,500 students. And one of the historic studios now, Quonset Hut, we're doing the songwriting program. Then we have another studio where we're Columbia Studio A, the original Columbia studio, where we're doing the engineering program, and then we have RCA Studio B, which is open to the public, where there's fan experience, a live experience. If you come to Nashville, you'll see Music Row. All those studios are just the same as they were, 60, 70, 80 years ago. And we're trying to keep it that way. But there's a lot of developers that see otherwise. So we're trying to keep it.
Yeah, that's great. I think there's something very special about just the historical quality of a place, and especially when you know how many great stuff happened in one place, right? Just the artistic vibe of a place that needs to be preserved.
You're right. So young would-be songwriters can be working in a place where Chris Christopherson wrote, or where great writers and great artists recorded. I think there's something about history. What is the saying? If you don't know where it's been, you're going to have trouble knowing where to take it. But we all lift ideas in our music from what has happened before, but we all look for ways to take it somewhere where it hasn't been, which isn't so easy. But it's great. It's great to still be doing it. I'm thrilled that you care about all this, and it's a beautiful thing, because this was a huge time in my life, and it was a huge time in musical transition, because the 60s, that period from, I want to say, basically the 60s, the transition from traditional rock and roll, from Elvis, Bill Haley, and the traditional rock and roll of the 50s, Chuck Berry, what many people, the real rock and roll, Jerry Lee Lewis, that 50s, and how in the 60s, there was a transition, some of which was very bland, and some of it very, very incredible and very out there. So you had the combination of these artists that were reaching out into psychedelic music. And at the same time, you had the very structured, produced music with the great songwriters from New York, and the very produced records. And then right in the middle of the 60s, you have the invasion of the Beatles, which took over American music for a good 5 years. And I had a unique thing. I was the producer for the Osmonds back then, and they were signed to my label. And I had a whole bunch of huge hits with them in the early 70s. And then Europe discovered them, England in particular, but Europe discovered them. And then all those records that I produced, like Puppy Love by Donny Osmond, Long Haired Lover from Liverpool by Jimmy Osmond, Love Me for a Reason by the Osmonds, all those records became monster hits in England. And then the Osmonds went over and they had 1.5 of the top 10 records, and I was the producer. And that's what really kicked my company off in the early 70s. We did the same. It was the same dynamic because those records would hit in America, but not in Europe. And then all of a sudden it exploded. And the Osmonds couldn't even move when they went to England. The girls were screaming and yelling. I don't know if you're probably too young to remember it all, but that was quite an exciting time. But the way music has transcended over the 60 years that I've been involved is just unbelievable. And trying to stay relevant in that is really important. And I think the way to stay relevant is to just not close the door to anything or anybody, and be open to all people, all walks of life. I think that our company is we learned a little bit from Kelly's Heroes. Some people might think that our company, that some of our people are different, but when you put them all together, they're doing pretty good. Our company's still going. And I wake up every morning excited to be in the record business.
Yeah, I think that's the same in the movies, right? You have so many different people and characters and people with different backgrounds and everything. And you just can't make a movie just on your own. You just can't do that. You need all those different people. You need all those different ideas and the input and everything. And I think that's when the magic happens, when you bring all these people together in the right way.
Yes, and I never thought it would happen again. And then at the start of this century, I was asked to do the music for Coyote Ugly. And so I put, I have the soundtrack somewhere. So
I have it right here.
Oh, you've got it there. All right.
I've got it.
Well, you see it's on Curve Records, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Charlie Daniels, who would have thought you take Charlie Daniels? But in any event, Leanne Rimes was on our label, and we got her to sing several songs, and Diane Warren wrote them. And it was, Can't Fight the Moonlight became a huge international hit. And it was very exciting. What happened with Leanne Rimes is she did these songs in the movie, and the soundtrack just exploded. And the album is over 5 million copies now. And here we are, and it's still selling. It's still selling now. Here's mine sitting on this. And we had a volume 2 as well. Of course, EMF was on it. Don Henley, Anyway, it was a fascinating thing to do. And again, it was all music. So if you hear about another Coyote Ugly, let us know. Because that was so amazing this century. Because I never thought that would happen again, that I would have a soundtrack where I could just put whatever I wanted in it, clear it for the records, and then market the soundtrack with the film. I just thought it would never happen again, because nowadays Disney owned the company that did the movie. It's one of the Disney companies. It wasn't Disney, but it was owned by Disney. It was one of their subsidiary companies, Miramax.
Miramax. Okay, yeah. Oh, yeah, right.
Yeah, it was Miramax. I was trying to think of that, and that was a very, very exciting thing to have that, and I'd love to see that happen again. It's been 25 years almost, and it still seems very fresh. But 5 million albums, can you believe it?
That's amazing.
Yeah, it was really a beautiful thing, and so I've been very blessed, very fortunate to be a part of it. But I'm very excited that you've taken the time to get interested in this and study this counterculture, because I think it was a very transformative time, not only for culture but for music, and particularly the transformation from traditional scores into rock and roll music being used in films, and then later on taken to the next level using actual records, like Roger did with Easy Rider, like what I did with Coyote Ugly, where you could take actual records and just fill out a score. Doesn't happen, well, I have to thank you for this, and it's great that you're interested in it because it was I mean, first of all, this was also very successful. I mean, from my standpoint, doing the music for almost all of them for that one period, I would say from 64 to 69, my company did almost every one of the films during that 5-year period. And then starting in 1970, the majors got it, like MGM did Clint Eastwood, and the major film studios got more involved. But that period where you had those independent film studios like AIP, from 64 to 69, as I say, I would roll out of bed in my underwear and start writing and maybe not even be dressed until noon, almost until I had to go out. It was almost like a factory. I always thought Motown in Detroit was like a factory, but it was almost a factory. And I was single at the time, and that's just all I did. And I didn't know anything else, but everybody was coming to me to do it. And I had all these writers working with me. Those 5 years, I think we did almost every one of these soundtracks. It's just unbelievable. And because I know that I was not the most talented person in Hollywood, but I was there at the right time, and I had enough talent and enough musical ability to relate to the producers, and then to write many of the songs myself or to co-write them. And then as we became more successful, people like Jackie DeShannon, who was a really cool girl, she at the time she would write with me. She's still alive. She would write songs with me, and I would go over to her house, and she was so talented. And she later had a career as an artist too. What the world needs now. She did the demo for Dionne Warwick, and it became the record by Jackie.
Oh, okay.
She had the hit, Jackie. She had Put a Little Love in Your Heart, which I think she wrote. But she was terrific. But some of the bigger writers, Barry Mann and Cynthia Wilde, would join us. But it was just a fascinating time for those 5-year period. We scored just, I'm looking at maybe 50 different soundtracks. Sometimes we played a small part. Sometimes we didn't write at all. Like in The Trip, I didn't write anything for The Trip. It was all done by Mike Bloomfield, and it was all done by Buddy Miles. So Electric Flag, I mean, that was what they called their group. I just marveled at it. They sort of took the template of what we did on the Wild Angels and then used the same template where they sat in the studio with the video going and all that. Well, thank you very much. Thank you for your time. I really
thank you so much.
I feel like I'm talking to my next door neighbor now.